what one thinks about an object doesn't necessarily change the substance of the object. Your thoughts don't necessarily change the substance of the object, although there's some research to suggest in some ways maybe it does affect the molecular structure. But one thing for sure, it changes our relationship to the object. The relationship between the subject and the object is very much impacted. It's indelibly impacted by the thoughts that one has. So if you sit down at your table and you look at your table as a mizbeach and you look at the food as a korban and you say a brocha, moitzi lechem min haaretz, you see this as a gift from the Ribbono Shel Olam, and you see the magic and wonder of the production of bread and what that really is. Those thoughts haven't changed the substantial structure of the table or of the loaf of bread, but it's certainly changed your relationship to what you're doing, your relationship between your table and yourself, the relationship between the bread and yourself, and how it impacts you. How an object impacts us is affected by the thoughts we have in the time that we're handling the object. We learned yesterday this amazing din in Kodshim, that if the Kohen takes an olah, a korban that has been acquired and brought for the purposes of an olah, and mistakenly he thinks it's a chatat and treats it as a chatat, it becomes a chatat. And we discussed that in some depth, and then the sugya goes on for more than a daf to analyze that and asks a lot of questions on it, and eventually comes to the statement at the end of the sugya, just before the next Mishnah, Eima de'amar Rabbi Yeshua la'afuke midei me'ila. This that we learned that Rabbi Yeshua said, that it becomes a chatat, is just so that there shouldn't be a problem of me'ilah. It was meant to be an olah. You've done the wrong things. You've brought it with all the activities and actions of a chatat. So is there now a problem of me'ilah that you now, if a kohen were to eat this chatat, which isn't really a chatat, it was brought as an olah, is he going to be guilty of me'ilah, of eating, using something which was set aside for kodshim? What is its status? So we say, no, it has the status of a chatat, and you can continue to treat it as a chatat. However, lemisak לחובה מי אמר? Rabbi Yeshua did not say that this counts as the obligation of the person to bring an olah. The person had to bring an olah. The kohen makes a mistake, treats it as a chatat. Rabbi Yeshua says, you can continue to treat it as a chatat. There's no me'ilah, but you still have to bring your olah. You haven't brought your olah. Rashi says very frustratingly, what does it mean? Do you think Rabbi Yeshua really meant that the olah becomes a chatat, that it magically transforms into a chatat, as we learned yesterday? No, that's not what he meant at all. It doesn't become a chatat. You can just treat it like chatat in as much as you're not over me'ilah as a result of that. Really, so all this enormously difficult Gemara that we've been busy on is just, like, it wasn't even real. We were only joking. It's not real. Just turns the whole sugya upside down. So frustrating. Tosfos doesn't accept that really and says, Tema, mai shna zu mizu. I don't understand. What's the difference between you saying it's treated like a chatat in that it's not me'ilah? You're now treating it like a chatat, and that's okay. You may treat it like a chatat, but it doesn't count as an olah. Why not? What is the difference between the two? And I'm working through Tosfos and through Rashi and just not beginning to understand, not being satisfied at all. To clear my mind, I decide to go into the living room and watch a bit of a documentary called The Mountain Queen. This is about a illiterate Nepalese woman who works washing dishes in the back house of a Whole Foods store in Connecticut, in the United States. And nobody knows that she is a multiple times record-breaking Himalayan Everest climber. And she takes time off and she goes to Nepal and she climbs Everest and she comes back and washes dishes. And I watch this for a few minutes and I come back into my study and I close the door and I say literally with tears in my eyes to the Ribbono Shel Olam, Ribbono Shel Olam, for me, Zevachim is Everest. That's what it is. I get it now. I know why I'm struggling. Zevachim is Everest. And I've had Sherpas leading me through the mountains of Moed and Noshim and Nezikim and teaching me to the best of my limited ability how to climb those mountains. But I've never had a Sherpa in Zevachim. Nobody's ever shown me how to climb Zevachim, how to climb Kodshim. And as I'm pouring my heart out, there's a gentle knock at the door. And at first I think this isn't real, and knock again, I open the door, and there's a very old Rosh Yeshiva walks in and sits down at my table. And he says, I'll be your Sherpa, what's bothering you? And I say, 1 minute. Before I put my life in the hands of somebody I don't know, who are you? Tell me, who are you? He says, you don't know me, I'm Rabbi Daniel Zakash. You don't know me, I died the year you were born, and I was a Rosh Yeshiva in Lithuania. Later on, I was a Rosh Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. I specialized in Zevachim and Menachos. And I'm buried in Rehovot, actually, not far away. And I'm a Talmud of Rabbi Lapin. I said, a Talmud of Rabbi Lapin? I can't believe this. Now, let me give you a little bit of a background of Rabbi Lapin. Rabbi Lapin was a contemporary of Reb Chaim Brisker, and they both learned by Reb Chaim's father, the Beis Halevi. But they both developed new methodologies of learning. They both innovated methods of learning that we use until today. There was a wonderful article written in a journal called Hamasilah that was published before the war by the Vada Rabbonim of New York. And in 1937, they published a piece about Rabbi Lapin and explained how both of them were Talmidim of the Beis Halevi, but Reb Chaim used the power of his mind and logic to understand what Chazal are saying. And Rabbi Lapin used the power of his mind and logic to understand why Chazal say what they say. So he innovated the whole Derech HaHigayon, which Reb Shimon Shkop later took to an even higher level. I say to Reb Daniel, Reb Lapin, I've been dying for something of Reb Lapin on Kodshim, but we've got nothing of his in anything. We've got his Talmidim. Reb Naftali Trop was a Talmud of Reb Lapin, but he didn't write a lot. And we don't have Reb Naftali Trop on Kodshim, and we don't have Reb Shimon Shkop on Kodshim. We certainly don't have Reb Lapin on Kodshim. And I was trained in that methodology, in the methodology of Reb and Reb Shimon Shkop. So I'm lost in Kodshim. So he says, let me tell you about my approach. And I've quoted what he told me at the bottom in the footnote. He says, I've written the Sefer to help people find Zevachim a little easier. Because in Zevachim, every idea you've got to spend hours and hours trying to understand, because it's so deep. And the problem is that most of what we've got on Kodshim has been generated by the school of Brisk, which is the Reb Chaim and the Briskerov's approach of understanding what Chazal said. But I've always had a need to understand a little more than that. Is why are Chazal saying what they need? Says Reb Daniel, I've made my approach to use straight thinking and logic. Straight thinking as my guardrails and logic as my balance. And most of these chidushim are built on these pillars. Using the power of logic, I've tried to make Zevachim and Menachos closer to what we can understand. On the surface, when you look at it, it's not about seichel, it's not about understanding. You can understand what it says, but not why it says it. Nevertheless, I penetrated into the depth of the subject, and I found sound logic, very nuanced but sound logic, through which we can understand the fine differences of the dinim of Kodshim. So I'm using the same methodology that you're accustomed to in Noshim and Nezikim. I'm using that methodology in Zevachim, and that's why I can help you. And he says, by the way, I made it a principle when I was writing my Sefer. I didn't read anything that anybody else wrote on the topic. I was determined to work these things out myself. When I'd finished the Sefer, I started looking at other people to see what they said. Because that was Rabbi Lapinovish's approach, that we're obligated, once we've learned the method of Torah, once we've been trained and schooled in the method of Torah, to use our own logic, to work things out ourselves. because the impact the Torah has on you comes from the way you think. It doesn't come from what you know. What you know is one thing, but it's the way you think, and you're obligated, Rabbi Laponovich has said, and Rabbi Daniel continues with this approach, to use your own thinking to try and get as far as you possibly can in understanding the sugyas. So tell me what's troubling you. And I explained this piece to him, the Rashi, the Tosfos, and I said, what interests me is this idea of lemisak לחובה mi amar. Although the korban works, it doesn't count. And I'm thinking to myself, where have we had that before? We've had that before in the first Mishnah of Zevachim, right in the beginning of the Masechta. What did we learn in the beginning of the Masechta? Kol hazvachim shenizbechu shelo lishmon. If you bring a korban for the wrong purpose, you think it was brought as an oila and you shecht it as a shlomim, or vice versa, it's not possible. It's kosher. It's a good korban. You can carry on with it, but it doesn't count for the owner. He's got to bring another one. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't there a linkage between what this Gemara is saying at the end of our sugya here and the very first Mishnah in Zevachim? But I can find nobody who even links them. And he gently puts his hand on my hand. He says, there, you've taken the first step up the mountain already. You've got it. You're on the right track. So let's go a little further. Go back and see what I wrote on Daf Beis, says Reb Daniel to me. So we go back and we look at what he wrote on Daf Beis. And look what he says. He introduces a brand new principle, which he uses later on to resolve all sorts of difficult things, including our sugya. Because in every korban there are two pieces. There is a piece which belongs to Hashem and a piece which belongs to the owner. Every korban consists of this partnership of these two pieces, a divine piece and a human piece. It's the owner's piece that brings atonement. And that's if the korban is brought the way it was intended initially. So you say, I'm chayav an oila. I have to bring a korban oila. I go and I buy a korban oila and I bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. Provided it's brought as the korban oila that I made it, I've done my duty and kapara works, atonement comes. And if it wasn't, atonement won't come. This is his chidush. But for Hashem, it doesn't make a difference if you brought it as an oil or you brought it as a shlomim. There's a generic set called korban, and that's what Hashem's interested in. For it to work for you, it's got to be a specific korban. But for it to work for Hashem, as long as it's a korban brought according to the laws of korbanot, it doesn't have to be a specific korban. It makes no difference to Hashem. V'chol hakorbanot im makrivim otam shelo lishman, nehi shehusar me'alem be'ezi shiur shem hakorban shehufrash kivan shehukrav l'shem korban acher. It's true, there's a little part of the korban, if it was supposed to be an oila and I bring it as a chatos, there's a little bit of mental damage done to the korban. But it doesn't make it not a korban. It's still a korban. It just was supposed to be an oila korban and now it's a chatos korban. But it's still a korban. For as far as Hashem is concerned, legavoa, who cares if it's an oila or a shlomim? It's still a korban, explains Reb Daniel. Lazot kol hakorbanot ksherim, and that's why they're all kasher. Now says Reb Daniel, let's come back to our Gemara. And here he says, we'll use the same principle, just as I said there. The hamachshava osar roshem kolshehu ala korban, that a thought makes a certain impression on a korban. And therefore, there's a little of the intended korban in the brought korban, because you're mixing the two. You intended it as an oila, you brought and you brought it as a chatos. There's a little of a mixture. And in as much as this machshava damages the ability of the korban to count for you, but it's still a korban kosher. But here he says, in our case, v'hacha nami Nema lehefech. In our Gemara, it works the other way around. The Kohen has made such a difference in the korban. He's put the blood at the bottom of the mizbeach instead of the top. He's done all the things he was supposed to do for a chatos. He's done, but the korban was supposed to be an oila. So he's made a big impression on this korban. Mitapech legamri v'naaseh chatat. It does become a chatat. He's learning like Tosfos, not like Rashi, that it absolutely becomes a chatat. V'imkein arei nigmara ha'avodah legamri, and therefore it's everything's done properly. He did a good chatat. Mikol v'chol v'tu ein bo me'ilah, and therefore there's no problem with me'ilah. This is a good korban chatas. רק היידה אינו עולה לבעליו לשם חטאת הוא בשביל החלק הקטן שנשאר עוד בקורבן מצד הקדשו הקודם לשם עולה. But it can't count because there's a little bit of oilo in it. It only counts when it's 100% as intended, because intention determines the relationship between object and subject. Intention doesn't change the object. The object is, it's a korban. Hashem accepts it. It's a korban. But does it impact me the way I intended it to impact me? No, I intended to impact me as an oilo, and this mentally is a chatos. And that mental perspective changes its impact on me. How I think about something changes its impact on me. We can't change our lives. We can't change our circumstances. We can't change what happens to the world and what happens to us. But we can completely change how we think about it. And how we think about it will determine how it affects us. And that's what's important in life. How is life affecting you? What changes in you is life bringing about? You can learn a piece of Gemara. If you don't think about it, you go through it mechanically, it doesn't affect you at all. You've done a mitzvah, you've learned Torah, but it hasn't changed you. When you start thinking deeply about it, it starts changing you. And two people who think differently about the piece of Gemara they've learned will be affected differently by the same piece of Gemara or the same Chazal, provided they're thinking deeply about it. And that's as Rabbi Daniel says, and as Rabbi Lapin says, you've got to think it through yourself. It's got to be your thinking if it's going to impact you. And we see this in the Korbanot, that if it's going to impact, the way it impacts you is going to depend on what thoughts were embedded in the Korban. That's what's going to affect whether it counts for you. But whether it counts as a korban, that's not about the thoughts. That's about doing the things correctly according to the requirements. And that's the whole idea, I suppose, of the issue of whether mitzvot tzrichot kavanah or not. The mitzvah is complete without kavanah. Everybody accepts that. If you do the mitzvah correctly, the mitzvah has been done correctly. But has it made a difference to you? Has it changed you? Has it had an impact on you? That depends on the thought process. Thought is what links action to subject. Thought is what links object to subject. How we think about things is what really matters. And therefore, as we go through this and we understand, here we see that we can actually bifurcate this halakha. So using Reb Daniel's principle, now the Gemara makes perfect sense. Says the Gemara, there are two elements in a korban as we learnt on Daf Beis. There's the God element and there's the man element. The God element, it's there's no me'ilah. It's not, Hashem's not saying this isn't a korban and if you eat from it you're over a me'ilah. No, this is still a korban. You fulfilled all the requirements of korban. You've done nothing wrong in terms of korbanos. But limisek לחובה. But how this connects to the owner, that's a matter of thought process. And since the thought process was one of a chatat instead of an oila, me, Omar, who says that would apply? That won't work, because with Daniel's principle we understand this. And with that he gives me this incredibly warm smile, and I realize this is going to change certainly my and hopefully our whole understanding of many things that we'll learn together as we go through Masechta Zevachim and Menachos.